Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we travel to a village where time itself has stopped telling the truth. In Ashmore village, the clock tower no longer chimes. Its face is cracked, its gears are broken, and beneath it, a man lies dead. Some say the clock tower failed years ago. Others say it stopped on purpose. But when a body is discovered at its base, exactly at midnight, one thing becomes clear. Time may be broken, but it still remembers. This is Death Beneath the Broken Clock Tower of Ashmore Village, a classic mystery investigated by Hercule Poirot. Settle in, lower the lights, and listen carefully, because in Ashmore, every second matters. Chapter 1. The clock tower that would not heal Ashmore Village had learned to live without time. That was how the locals described it, not as a joke, not even as exaggeration, but as a quiet truth, accepted the way one accepts bad weather or an old injury that never quite mends. The clock tower at the center of the village square had stopped chiming 7 years ago. Its face was cracked like aged porcelain. Its hands were frozen just before midnight, and no one could remember exactly when it had last worked properly. Only that life in Ashmore seemed to divide neatly into before and after its silence. At night, the tower loomed like a question no one wished to answer. On the evening of October 14th, a thin mist settled over Ashmore earlier than usual. It crept between cottages, softened the outlines of hedges, and pulled gently around the base of the clock tower as though drawn to it. Lanterns flickered to life one by one, their warm glow failing to reach the upper stone where the broken clock face stared blindly at the village below. Most people had gone inside by 10:30. They always did. There were no rules, no curfews, just habit. Ashmore was a village that preferred doors closed after dark, especially near the square. The clock tower had a way of making people feel watched, even though it no longer worked, especially because it no longer worked. Mrs. Eliza Morton locked her shop at precisely 10:45. She paused, as she always did, keys still in hand, and glanced up at the clock tower, the hands unmoving. "Still broken," she muttered, as though expecting it to answer. She had lived in Ashmore all her life. She remembered the chime, how it once marked weddings, funerals, harvests, and Sundays with equal authority. She remembered when the sound had stopped abruptly one winter night during a storm. After that, repairs were promised, then delayed, then quietly abandoned. Some said the mechanism was too old. Others said the village council lacked funds. A few, always the same few, said the tower did not want to be fixed. Mrs. Morton did not believe that, but she did not linger either. At 11:30, a single figure crossed the square. Jonathan Crow walked quickly, collar turned up against the cold, boots striking the cobblestones with purpose. He was not a man who enjoyed walking at night, and Ashmore knew it. The sight of him alone after dark would have been unusual to anyone watching, but no one was. Jonathan Crow carried a leather satchel tucked tightly under his arm. It was heavy, not with money but with documents, papers he had sworn to protect, papers he had also threatened to expose. He paused briefly at the edge of the square and looked up at the clock tower. "Still dead," he murmured. There was no bitterness in his voice, only calculation. The clock tower stood on older ground than the village itself. Its base was thick stone, worn smooth by centuries of weather and footsteps. Above, the narrow tower rose in uneven stages, each level marked by narrow slits where bells had once hung. The highest chamber housed the mechanism, a place no one had entered in years. The council had sealed the door at ground level. Officially, it was for safety. Unofficially, it was because no one wanted responsibility for what they might find inside. Jonathan Crow stepped closer, boots crunching softly on gravel. He checked his watch. 11:56 p.m., 4 minutes. No one ever admitted to hearing footsteps near the tower that night, not the vicar who sat reading by the fire, not the schoolteacher who claimed she was asleep, not the publican who insisted he was locking up. But later, when questions were asked, several villagers would say the same thing. The air felt different, heavier, as though something long ignored had finally decided to make itself known. At exactly midnight, the village heard a sound it had not heard in years. Not a chime, a crack, a sharp, echoing fracture that split the quiet like a snapped bone. Mrs. Morton sat upright in bed. The vicar dropped his book. The publican froze with his hand on the door latch. And somewhere beneath the clock tower, Jonathan Crow fell forward, his satchel hitting the ground before he did. The body was discovered at dawn. A milk boy found it first, bicycle skidding to a halt as he stared at the figure sprawled at the base of the tower. Jonathan Crow lay on his back, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, as though surprised by the manner of his ending. The satchel lay beside him, unopened. The cracked clock face above showed the same frozen time it always had, 11:58. Yet everyone agreed on one thing: Jonathan Crow had died at midnight. By mid-morning, Ashmore village was buzzing with restrained panic. The constable arrived from the neighboring town, notebook already open, expression carefully neutral. Villagers gathered in small knots, speaking in lowered voices, glancing repeatedly toward the square. The clock tower had never felt closer. Dr. Edwin Hale, the local physician, examined the body briefly before shaking his head. "No obvious wounds," he said. "No sign of a fall from height." "Heart?" the constable asked. "Possibly," Hale replied, "but it seems sudden." The satchel was opened. Inside were letters, financial records, land deeds, documents that hinted at long-standing disputes within the village. Names appeared repeatedly. Some of them belonged to people now standing only a few yards away. The constable's expression tightened. The village council convened within the hour. They spoke of tragedy, they spoke of shock, they spoke of coincidence. No one spoke of the clock tower, not directly, but every gaze drifted upward eventually. By noon, a telegram had been sent. Not to London police, not to the county inspector, but to a man known for understanding crimes that preferred to disguise themselves as accidents. Hercule Poirot received the message just after lunch. He read it once, then again, adjusting his moustache thoughtfully. "A broken clock tower," he murmured. "A death at midnight, and a village that pretends time is irrelevant." He smiled faintly. "Time," Poirot said softly, "is never irrelevant." He folded the telegram, reached for his coat, and rang for his luggage. That evening, Ashmore village waited. Some waited for answers. Some waited for blame. Some waited for the past to remain buried. Above them all, the clock tower stood silent, cracked and unmoving, as it had for years. But for the first time since it stopped, the village felt certain of one thing. Time had not been broken. It had been patient, and now it had begun to collect what was owed. Chapter 2. The village that measured its words. Ashmore village did not welcome outsiders easily. It never had. The cottages leaned inward, as though sharing confidences the road was not meant to hear. Windows watched more than they revealed. Even the air felt cautious, not hostile but reserved, like a room that pauses its conversation when a stranger enters. Hercule Poirot noticed this at once. He arrived on the early afternoon train, stepping down onto the small platform with his suitcase in one hand and his cane in the other. The station was modest, its paint faded, its clock working perfectly, a detail Poirot registered with quiet interest. A working clock at the edge of a village with a broken one at its heart. "How very instructive," he murmured. Constable Harold Fenwick waited for him. Fenwick was young, not inexperienced, but still hopeful enough to believe that facts would speak if one listened hard enough. He removed his hat respectfully as Poirot approached. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming." Poirot inclined his head. "You said the death occurred at midnight." "Yes, or very close to it." "And the clock tower?" Poirot asked gently. Fenwick hesitated. "Still broken." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, then time is already uncooperative." They walked toward the village square together. As they approached, the clock tower came into view, taller than Poirot had imagined, its cracked face catching the daylight like a wounded eye. The hands remained frozen just before midnight, unmoving, unapologetic. Poirot stopped. He did not look at the body's former position. He did not ask for reports. He looked at the tower itself. A clock, Poirot said quietly, is an agreement between time and people. Fenwick frowned. Sir? When a clock stops, Poirot continued, it is not merely a machine that fails, it is an agreement that is broken. He turned to Fenwick. Tell me, Constable, who wanted time to remain broken? Fenwick blinked. I don't know, Poirot nodded. We shall. The body had been removed, but the ground remembered. Poirot examined the stones beneath the tower with meticulous care. There were no signs of a fall from height, no shattered stone, no blood spatter consistent with impact. Jonathan Crowe had died beneath the tower, not from it. Poirot straightened. Tell me about the deceased, he said. Fenwick consulted his notes. Jonathan Crowe, 46, solicitor by training, though he left formal practice years ago. He handled private financial matters for several villagers. Quiet man, precise. Enemies? Poirot asked. Fenwick hesitated. He was persistent. Poirot smiled gently. Persistence is often mistaken for aggression. Fenwick nodded. He was involved in disputes, land rights, old debts, matters people hoped had been forgotten. Poirot tapped his cane lightly on the stone. And the satchel? Untouched, Fenwick said, full of documents. Nothing missing. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then this was not robbery, Fenwick exhaled. No. They moved on. Ashmore village revealed itself slowly. A butcher, a grocer, a public house, a vicarage. Poirot observed faces more than buildings. People looked away quickly, not guiltily, carefully. Poirot noticed that too. Who last saw Jonathan Crowe alive? He asked. Fenwick cleared his throat. Mrs. Eliza Morton. She runs the general store. Then let us begin with someone who has learned to sell truth by the ounce, Poirot replied. Mrs. Morton's shop smelled of tea leaves and old wood. She stood behind the counter when Poirot entered, hands folded, posture stiff. Monsieur Poirot, Fenwick said, this is Mrs. Eliza Morton. Poirot bowed slightly. Madame, she returned the gesture awkwardly. I've heard of you. Poirot smiled. I hope not always favorably. She hesitated. I saw Jonathan that night. Poirot nodded. Tell me how you saw him. He locked up late, she said. Later than usual. He looked resolved. Poirot tilted his head. Resolved to do what? Mrs. Morton swallowed. I don't know, but he wasn't frightened. Poirot noted this. And did he mention the clock tower? Poirot asked. Mrs. Morton's eyes flicked just for a moment toward the window. No, she said quickly. No one talks about it. Poirot smiled faintly. That is rarely true, madame. Next, they visited the public house. The landlord, Thomas Greaves, was a broad man with a careful smile. Jonathan Crowe, Greaves said. Yes, he came by earlier that evening, didn't drink. Poirot raised an eyebrow. At a public house? Greaves shrugged. He asked questions instead. What sort? Poirot asked. Greaves hesitated. About the tower. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And what did you tell him? Greaves shifted his weight. Nothing useful. Everyone knows it's unsafe. Unsafe how? Poirot asked softly. Greaves avoided his eyes. Structurally. Poirot nodded slowly. Tell me, Poirot continued, has anyone tried to repair it? Greaves laughed uneasily. The council talked, then they stopped. Poirot smiled. Why? Greaves sighed. Because someone always objected. Who? Poirot asked. Greaves shook his head. Always someone different. Poirot tapped his cane thoughtfully. The vicar was next. Reverend Miles Hawthorne welcomed Poirot with nervous politeness. The clock tower, the vicar said. A sad symbol, really. Poirot inclined his head. Symbols often kill. The vicar blinked. Pardon? Poirot smiled gently. Tell me, Reverend, did Jonathan Crowe seek counsel? The vicar hesitated. Yes. Poirot waited. He said, the vicar continued slowly, that the village had lived too long on borrowed time. Poirot's eyes brightened. And what did you say? The vicar looked away. I told him forgiveness requires readiness. Poirot nodded. And was the village ready? The vicar's silence answered for him. By evening, Poirot had learned enough to confirm one thing. Ashmore village had agreed, silently, collectively, not to ask certain questions, and Jonathan Crowe had asked them anyway. Poirot returned to the square alone. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the stones. The clock tower loomed above him, mute and unrepentant. Poirot studied the ground carefully. Something caught his eye. A faint scuff mark, not recent, not dramatic, but deliberate. He crouched. Interesting, he murmured. Fenwick approached. What is it? Poirot straightened. Jonathan Crowe did not arrive alone, Poirot said, quietly. Fenwick frowned. No one reported. Poirot raised a finger. No one reports what they do not wish to remember. He gestured toward the base of the tower. There was an argument here, Poirot said. Quiet, controlled, and very close to midnight. Fenwick swallowed. Tomorrow, Poirot continued, we will climb the clock tower. Fenwick blinked. Sir, it's sealed, Poirot smiled. Then it has something to hide. As night fell, the village settled uneasily. Doors closed early. Lamps dimmed. Poirot stood by his inn window and looked out toward the square. The clock tower was barely visible, its outline darker than the sky behind it. 11:59 approached. Poirot checked his watch. 11:59. The village held its breath. Midnight passed. Nothing happened. No chime, no crack, no sound at all. Poirot smiled faintly. Good, he murmured. The first night always lies. He turned away from the window, because he knew something Ashmore did not yet understand. The broken clock tower had not stopped time. It had merely given someone control over when it mattered. Chapter 3. Inside the tower, time still moved. Who is Edith Vale? Poirot asked. Fenwick hesitated. She owns the old mill property outside the village. Her family did. She's private. Poirot nodded slowly. And what did Jonathan Crowe intend to do with these documents? Fenwick exhaled. Expose something. Land fraud, perhaps. A cover-up from years ago. Poirot folded the papers. Then, he said quietly, the murderer did not kill for money alone. Fenwick frowned. For what then? Poirot's voice lowered. For time, he said, for the 7 years between the tower's silence and today. He looked at Fenwick. What happened 7 years ago, Constable? Fenwick swallowed hard. I don't know, he said. Poirot smiled faintly. Then, Poirot replied, that is our next question. Chapter 4. 7 Years of Borrowed Silence. Ashmore village had not changed in 7 years. That, Hercule Poirot realized as he studied the parish records spread neatly across the inn's small dining table. The ink was faded in places, the paper brittle at the edges, but the patterns were intact. Unchanged, undisturbed, and carefully ignored. 7 years ago, the clock tower had stopped. 7 years ago, Ashmore had decided not to ask why. Poirot adjusted his mustache. Ah, he murmured, now we listen to the past. The records told a dull story on the surface, a structural inspection of the clock tower following a winter storm, a declaration of unsafe condition, a council vote postponing repairs, a second vote cancelling them entirely. The minutes were polite, efficient, empty. Poirot closed the ledger gently. Constable, he said to Harold Fenwick, who stood nearby, tell me about the storm. Fenwick hesitated. It was severe, roofs damaged, flooding near the old mill. Poirot's eyes sharpened. The mill? Yes, Fenwick said. The Vale Mill. It sits on the river bend. Poirot nodded slowly. And who owned it then? He asked. Fenwick exhaled. Edith Vale, she still does. Poirot smiled faintly. Ownership that survives storms is rarely accidental. That afternoon, Poirot requested a walk, not to the clock tower, not to the square, to the mill. The path followed the river, winding past hedges and fields that looked peaceful enough to convince a stranger. But Poirot noticed where the land dipped unnaturally, where stone embankments looked newer than their surroundings. Repairs, selective ones. The mill came into view, tall, narrow, its brickwork darkened by age and damp. The water wheel was gone, replaced by a concrete reinforcement wall that did not belong to the original structure. Poirot stopped. "Here," he said quietly. Fenwick frowned. "What about it?" Poirot pointed with his cane. "This wall, it was not built 7 years ago. It was built because of 7 years ago." Fenwick swallowed. "You think the storm damaged?" Poirot nodded. "And someone paid to hide it." Edith Vale answered the door herself. She was a woman in her early 60s, dressed plainly, posture upright, eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that had learned not to advertise itself. She looked at Poirot not with fear, but with calculation. "Monsieur Poirot," she said calmly, "I wondered when you would come." Poirot inclined his head. "Madame Val, you have been expecting time." She smiled thinly. "Time comes whether one expects it or not." Poirot appreciated that answer. They sat in the mill's small sitting room, the river audible through thick stone walls. Poirot spoke first. "7 years ago," he said gently. "There was a storm?" Edith nodded. "Yes," Poirot continued. "The river rose. The embankment failed." Edith folded her hands. "Briefly," Poirot leaned forward. "Briefly enough that repairs could be made quietly." Edith's gaze hardened. "Ashmore is a quiet village," Poirot nodded. "Yes, it specializes in that." Poirot laid one document on the table, a land deed from Jonathan Crow's satchel. "This," Poirot said, "suggests the embankment encroached onto public land after the storm." Edith did not deny it. "The river moved," she said. "Land is not fixed." Poirot smiled faintly. "Law disagrees." Edith's jaw tightened. Poirot continued calmly. "Jonathan Crow discovered this discrepancy. He also discovered that the clock tower inspection report was amended shortly after." Edith's eyes flickered. Poirot pressed gently. "The tower was declared unsafe. Repairs were postponed. Why?" Edith exhaled slowly. "Because the council did not want attention." Poirot nodded. "Attention brings inspectors. Inspectors bring maps." Edith's voice sharpened. "You think I bribed them?" Poirot shook his head. "No, you persuaded them." Edith smiled bitterly. "That is worse." Fenwick shifted uncomfortably. Poirot raised a hand. 7 years ago," Poirot continued, "the clock tower stopped, not because it was broken beyond repair, but because silence was useful." Edith met his gaze steadily. "Yes." Fenwick stared. "You admit it?" Edith nodded. "I admit necessity." Poirot's tone remained soft. "And Jonathan Crow?" Edith looked away toward the river. "He was young then," she said. "Idealistic. He wanted things corrected." Poirot nodded. "And you convinced him to wait?" "Yes." Poirot asked quietly. "What did you promise him?" Edith closed her eyes. "That I would make things right. Eventually." Poirot's gaze softened. "And eventually never came." Poirot rose and walked to the window. "The clock tower," he said, "was not broken by the storm. It was silenced by agreement." Edith did not argue. Poirot turned back. "Jonathan Crow returned to the matter recently," Poirot continued. "Why?" Edith's voice was low. "Because he was dying." Fenwick stiffened. "Dying?" Edith nodded. "An illness. He didn't tell many." Poirot's eyes narrowed with understanding. "He wanted the truth spoken before he could not speak," Poirot said softly. Edith nodded once. "And you," Poirot continued, "wanted 7 more years." Edith's voice trembled for the first time. "I wanted to protect what my family built." Poirot nodded. "Protection can become possession." Poirot leaned on his cane. "Last night," he said, "Jonathan Crow stood beneath the clock tower with documents that would undo 7 years of silence." Edith's jaw clenched. Poirot continued. "Someone met him there." Edith did not answer. Poirot's voice remained calm. "You did not intend to kill him." Edith closed her eyes. "No." Poirot opened the mechanical timer evidence bag Fenwick carried. "This device," Poirot said, "was installed to signal midnight, to draw attention away from a private confrontation." Edith whispered, "I wanted witnesses distracted." Poirot nodded. "And In that moment, something went wrong. Edith's shoulders sagged. He collapsed, she whispered. I thought he fainted. Poirot's voice was gentle. But he died. Silence filled the room. Fenwick spoke at last. Mrs. Vale, did you touch him? Edith shook her head. No, I only argued. I told him to wait. Poirot nodded. But fear, Poirot added, can kill as efficiently as poison. Edith looked up sharply. Poirot continued. The sound startled him. His heart failed, and you ran. Edith whispered, Yes. Poirot closed the evidence bag. 7 years, he said quietly. You borrowed silence, and silence charged interest. Edith did not resist when Fenwick stepped forward. I knew time would collect, she said softly. I just didn't think it would be him. Poirot met her gaze. It is always the messenger, he said gently, who pays first. As they walked back toward Ashmore, the clock tower loomed ahead. Fenwick exhaled. So she killed him. Poirot shook his head. She confronted him, Poirot said, and time finished the work. Fenwick frowned. That won't satisfy everyone, Poirot smiled faintly. Truth rarely does. They stopped in the square. Poirot looked up at the frozen hands. Tonight, Poirot said, we will test the village. Fenwick blinked. How? Poirot's eyes gleamed. We will let midnight come again, he said, and see who listens too closely. Chapter 5. The trap set for midnight Ashmore village did not like plans. Not official ones, not spoken ones, and certainly not ones that involved the clock tower at midnight. By late afternoon, word had already spread that the tower had been opened. People did not say it directly. They said things like, Fenwick's been busy, or Poirot is poking about, or best stay indoors tonight. But Poirot heard the real message beneath the polite phrases, do not make the village remember. Hercule Poirot sat at the inn's small table with a cup of tea untouched, listening as Fenwick described the town's mood. They're nervous, Fenwick said. Not angry, just tight. Poirot nodded. Of course, we are pulling at the stitch that keeps their coat closed. Fenwick frowned. You really intend to do it? Keep people in the square at midnight? Poirot's eyes gleamed mildly. Not keep them, invite them. Fenwick exhaled. They won't come. Poirot smiled faintly. Then we will learn who cannot resist. Poirot's plan was simple, which made it dangerous. He asked Fenwick to post a notice, not dramatic, not accusatory, just a public statement that the clock tower would be examined again at midnight due to ongoing inquiries. Fenwick protested, of course, warning that it would cause panic. Poirot insisted. When people are afraid, Poirot said softly, they make errors. When they are comfortable, they make routines. Tonight, we want the errors. Fenwick pinned the notice near the shop and the inn. Within an hour, it was gone. Someone had removed it. Fenwick returned, furious. They tore it down. Poirot only nodded as though this were expected. Put it back, Poirot said calmly. And this time, watch who watches you. By dusk, Ashmore felt like a room where the conversation had stopped, but the tension had not. Lanterns lit early, curtains were drawn. The inn served dinner to fewer people than usual. Even the river seemed quieter, its surface smoothing into a dark ribbon. Poirot walked through the square as the sky deepened. He studied the base of the clock tower, the stones, the door, the cobblestones where Jonathan Crowe had fallen. He crouched once, tapping gently at a stone near the tower's shadow. Fenwick approached. What are you looking for now? Poirot straightened. A second truth, Fenwick blinked. Poirot gestured toward the cobblestones. The first truth is that Edith Vale argued with Jonathan Crowe here. The second truth is that someone else has been protecting the village's silence longer than Edith, Fenwick frowned. You mean another person involved in the 7-year cover-up? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Yes, someone. With influence, someone whose hands never touch the crime, but whose words make it possible. Fenwick swallowed. Who? Poirot smiled faintly. Let midnight answer. At 11:30, Poirot asked Fenwick to fetch 2 lanterns and position 2 constables, borrowed from the neighboring town, near the tower entrance. not to block access, but to be seen. Visibility was part of the trap. Poirot then did something that surprised Fenwick. He entered the clock tower alone. "You're going in?" Fenwick asked, alarmed. Poirot nodded. "I wish the village to think I'm adjusting something." Fenwick frowned. "But you are." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I am adjusting them." Inside the tower, Poirot climbed halfway and stopped at the landing. He opened his pocket watch. He listened to the tower's silence, to the river beyond, to the faint creak of wood. Then he produced a small metal object. From his coat, not evidence, but a simple mechanical tool. He tapped the stone twice lightly. He waited. Then he tapped again, slightly louder. A signal, not one meant to be heard by the whole village, only by someone who had been listening for years. Poirot smiled faintly. "The guilty," he murmured, "always recognize their own language." When Poirot emerged 10 minutes later, Fenwick's face was pale with curiosity. "What did you do in there?" Poirot adjusted his gloves. "Nothing important." Fenwick frowned. "Then why—" Poirot raised a finger. "Shh, look." Across the square, near the vicarage lane, a figure stood briefly in the shadows, watching, then moving away quickly. Fenwick whispered, "Who was that?" Poirot's eyes were calm. "Someone who believes time can be managed." 11:55. Poirot and Fenwick took their places near the clock tower base. The borrowed constables stood farther back, lanterns held high. The square was not empty, but it was not full either. A handful of villagers had gathered at the edges, Mrs. Morton behind her shop window, Thomas Greaves in the inn doorway, and two councilmen pretending they had just happened to step outside. And then there was the vicar. Reverend Miles Hawthorne appeared quietly, hands clasped, expression solemn. Fenwick blinked. "He came?" Poirot's gaze fixed on the vicar. "Yes," Poirot murmured. "Of course he did." 11:58. Poirot looked up at the clock face, still frozen at 11:58, still cracked, still accusing. Fenwick whispered, "Do you think it'll make that crack sound again?" Poirot's voice was low. "If someone has reinstalled the device." Fenwick's eyes widened. "But we have it." Poirot smiled faintly. "We have one device." He looked toward the tower door. "There can be another." Fenwick swallowed. 11:59. The village held its breath. Poirot observed faces in lantern light. Mrs. Morton's eyes wide, fearful. Greaves rigid, jaw clenched. The councilmen tense, whispering to one another. And Reverend Hawthorne, too calm. Poirot noticed the vicar's hands. They were not clasped in prayer. They were clasped in restraint. Midnight. Nothing happened. No crack, no sound, no sudden drama. A wave of confused relief passed through the small crowd. Someone laughed nervously. Poirot did not. He watched Reverend Hawthorne, who exhaled, not with relief, but with disappointment, a subtle reaction, a guilty reaction. Poirot stepped forward. "Reverend," he said softly. The vicar looked up. "Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot's tone remained polite. "You expected the sound." The vicar frowned. "I don't know what you—" Poirot tilted his head. "You expected the signal to occur again, because you have been using the tower's brokenness as a shield for 7 years." The vicar's face stiffened. Fenwick whispered, "Sir." Poirot raised a hand to quiet him. "Do you know," Poirot said calmly, "why the village removed our notice?" The vicar's lips tightened. "Because someone feared gathering witnesses," Poirot continued. "Not Edith Vale, not merely her, someone who has been protecting the original cover-up." The vicar's voice was low. "You have no proof." Poirot smiled faintly. "Not proof, not yet." Poirot gestured toward the tower. "But I have timing," he said, "and I have your reaction." The vicar's composure cracked slightly. "You think because I came here at midnight," Poirot interrupted gently. "No, many came, but you came with the calm of a man who expected control." He leaned closer. "And you were disappointed when nothing happened." The vicar's eyes flashed. "This is absurd." Poirot nodded. "Yes, that is why it is effective." Fenwick shifted. "Reverend Hawthorne, where were you last night at midnight?" The vicar's jaw clenched. In my study. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Alone? The vicar hesitated. Yes. Poirot smiled faintly. A convenient prayer. Poirot turned to the villagers watching from the edges. Mesdames, messieurs, he said softly, you have lived 7 years with a broken tower because it was useful to someone. Murmurs rose. Poirot continued. Jonathan Crowe was killed because he decided the village should stop pretending. The murmurs grew sharper. Poirot raised a hand. Tonight, nothing happened at midnight because someone tried to remove the possibility of witnesses. He looked directly at the vicar. Someone removed our notice, Poirot said. Someone watched me go into the tower. The vicar's face hardened. You're inciting them. Poirot smiled gently. No, Reverend, I am inviting truth. Fenwick leaned in, whispering urgently. Monsieur Poirot, if the vicar is involved, then Edith Vale. Poirot nodded. Edith acted. The vicar enabled. Fenwick's eyes widened. Enabled what? Poirot's voice lowered. The original cover-up. He looked up at the tower. And perhaps, Poirot added, the timing of last night as well. Fenwick swallowed. You think the vicar met Jonathan Crowe? Fenwick whispered. Poirot's eyes hardened. I think he arranged the meeting. Poirot stepped away from the crowd and spoke quietly to Fenwick. Constable, he said, tomorrow morning we will search the vicarage. Fenwick blinked. Can we? Poirot smiled faintly. With the proper suspicion, yes. Fenwick's voice was tense. And tonight? Poirot looked back at the vicar. Tonight, Poirot murmured, we let him believe he has survived. He turned toward the village. And then, Poirot said softly, we see what he does when he thinks he is safe. The villagers began to disperse, unsettled and murmuring. Doors opened, lanterns bobbed away, windows blinked shut. The square emptied again, but not entirely. Reverend Hawthorne lingered a moment longer than anyone else. He stared up at the frozen clock face, then he turned and walked away, quickly, as if escaping the tower's shadow. Poirot watched him go. Ah, Poirot whispered, now we have motion. Chapter 6. The quiet study and the loudest truth. Morning arrived in Ashmore without apology. Sunlight cut cleanly through the square, revealing what night had softened, the age in the stone, the fatigue in the cottages, the clock tower's crack now looking less like a wound and more like a scar that had healed badly. The village behaved as though nothing unusual had happened at midnight. That, Hercule Poirot thought, was precisely the point. Silence was Ashmore's strongest habit. At 9:30, Constable Harold Fenwick knocked on the vicarage door. Reverend Miles Hawthorne answered almost immediately, dressed neatly, expression composed, Bible tucked under one arm as though it were part of his uniform. Constable, Monsieur Poirot, he said calmly. To what do I owe the pleasure? Poirot smiled politely. To your hospitality, Reverend. Hawthorne's eyes flickered, only for a fraction of a second, before he stepped aside. Of course, the vicarage was warm, orderly, and deliberately unremarkable. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with theological texts and parish records. Everything looked chosen to reassure. Poirot noted that too. They began in the sitting room. Poirot did not touch anything at first. He walked slowly, letting the room introduce itself. The furniture was old but well cared for. The carpet bore the soft wear of years, not neglect. Reverend, Poirot said gently, you came to the square last night. Hawthorne nodded. Naturally, I wish to ensure calm. Poirot inclined his head. And when nothing happened at midnight, you seemed disappointed? The vicar smiled thinly. That is your interpretation? Poirot nodded. Yes, and interpretations interest me. Fenwick shifted uncomfortably. Poirot continued. We will search the vicarage, Reverend. Hawthorne's expression hardened slightly. On what grounds? Poirot's tone remained courteous. On the grounds that you expected an event that did not occur. The vicar exhaled. Very well. The study was at the back of the house. It was a narrow room with a large desk positioned carefully beneath a window. Papers were stacked neatly, each pile squared, aligned, disciplined. Poirot smiled faintly. Order, he murmured. A comforting illusion, Hawthorne stiffened. I object to— Poirot raised a hand. Please, you object later. Fenwick began opening drawers. Nothing unusual at first, correspondence, sermons, parish schedules. Then Fenwick paused. Sir, he said quietly. Poirot approached. In the bottom drawer, beneath hymn sheets, lay a leather folder, newer than everything else in the room. Poirot opened it. Inside were copies of land records, the same records Jonathan Crowe had carried. Fenwick's breath caught. These are— Poirot nodded. Yes, Hawthorne's voice sharpened. I advise people, that is my duty. Poirot looked up calmly. You advised Edith Vale. Hawthorne did not deny it. You advised her to delay, Poirot continued. To protect the village from scandal, Hawthorne's jaw clenched. I protected livelihoods. Poirot closed the folder gently. And in doing so, he said, you taught the village that silence was virtuous. Poirot moved to the desk. On its surface sat a small brass object, unremarkable at first glance. Poirot picked it up, a winding key, not for a clock tower mechanism, but for a mechanical timer. Fenwick's eyes widened. Hawthorne's voice dropped. That proves nothing. Poirot smiled faintly. No, it proves habit. He placed the key beside the evidence folder. You have been winding time for 7 years, Reverend, Poirot said softly. Not to make it move, but to keep it still. Hawthorne's composure cracked. You think I wanted Jonathan Crowe dead? He snapped. Poirot shook his head gently. No, he said. You wanted him patient. Hawthorne laughed bitterly. Patience is a virtue. Poirot's eyes hardened. Only when chosen. Fenwick found the letters next. They were tucked inside a Bible, not hidden, merely placed. Poirot read, One aloud. If the tower remains silent, the inspectors will not return. Time buys us safety. Poirot looked up. Your handwriting, he said. Hawthorne's shoulders sagged. Yes, he said quietly. Mine, Fenwick swallowed. So you orchestrated the cover-up, Hawthorne nodded. Yes, Poirot leaned closer. And last night, Poirot asked. Hawthorne's voice wavered. I told Jonathan to meet me at the tower. I wanted to convince him one last time, Poirot nodded. And Edith Vale. She insisted on being there, Hawthorne said. She feared exposure. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. And the device? Poirot asked. Hawthorne whispered, I installed it years ago, to scare away curiosity, to remind the village that the tower was dangerous. Poirot opened his eyes. And Jonathan Crowe, Poirot said softly, recognized it as a lie. Hawthorne's voice broke. He said truth had waited long enough. So Fenwick spoke carefully. Reverend, did you touch him? Hawthorne shook his head. No, he collapsed after the sound. I panicked. Poirot nodded. Yes, Poirot said. Fear again. Poirot turned away from the desk and walked to the window. The tragedy, Poirot said quietly, is not that Jonathan Crowe died beneath a broken clock tower. He turned back. It is that he died because the village trusted men who spoke gently. Hawthorne closed his eyes. I thought I was protecting them, he whispered. Poirot's voice softened. You protected a lie. The arrest was quiet. Hawthorne did not resist. He allowed Fenwick to take him into custody with the dignity of a man who had finally run out of arguments. As they stepped outside, villagers watched from behind curtains. Poirot did not look at them. He looked at the clock tower. The tower did not break the village, Poirot murmured. The village broke the tower. Fenwick exhaled. So the murder was accidental. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, Fenwick frowned. But the guilt, Poirot interrupted gently, is deliberate. Fenwick absorbed this. What now? He asked. Poirot smiled faintly. Now, he said, we let the truth speak without timing. That evening, Poirot returned to the square alone. The sun dipped low. The clock tower's shadow stretched long across the stones. For the first time since his arrival, Poirot felt the case nearing its natural end, not resolution, but reckoning. He checked his watch. 11:58. He looked up. The frozen hand still pointed accusingly at the same minute. Soon, Poirot murmured. Not to the clock, to the village. Chapter 7. When silence learned to speak, Ashmore village did not erupt after the arrest. It withdrew, doors closed more firmly, voices lowered another register. Yes, the square emptied earlier than usual, as though darkness might overhear what daylight could not. If the village had once practiced silence out of convenience, it now practiced it out of fear that more names might be spoken aloud. Hercule Poirot observed this with quiet precision. He stood at the inn window the morning after the vicar's arrest, watching Mrs. Morton open her shop without greeting anyone, watching Thomas Greaves wipe the same patch of counter again and again, watching the councilmen pass one another without nods. Ashmore had lost its shared alibi. That, Poirot murmured, is the sound of a village thinking. By mid-morning, Constable Harold Fenwick returned from the station with news. The charge will be conspiracy to obstruct, inducement, and negligence contributing to death, Fenwick said. The Crown's representative arrives tomorrow. Poirot nodded. And the village? Fenwick hesitated. They're divided. Some say the vicar betrayed them. Others say he saved them for 7 years. Poirot smiled faintly. Both can be true. That is what makes it uncomfortable. Fenwick swallowed. And Edith Vale. Poirot turned from the window. She will come today. Fenwick blinked. How do you know? Poirot's eyes softened. Because silence has stopped protecting her. Edith Vale arrived just after noon. She did not knock timidly. She did not arrive escorted. She walked into the inn with the steady resolve of a woman who had rehearsed the moment and found rehearsal unnecessary. She removed her gloves and placed them on the table. I will not pretend any more, she said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. Then please, madame, sit. Edith sat, posture upright, eyes fixed not on Poirot but on the window beyond him, toward the square and the clock tower's cracked face. I thought, she said slowly, that if the tower stayed broken, time would stay kind. Poirot listened without interruption. When the storm came 7 years ago, Edith continued, the river nearly took the mill, the embankment failed, the land shifted. We rebuilt quickly, quietly, before inspectors arrived. Poirot nodded. With help? Edith's mouth tightened. Yes. The vicar, Poirot said gently. Edith nodded. He told me silence would protect everyone. Poirot's voice was calm. And Jonathan Crowe? Edith's breath caught. Jonathan believed protection was another word for theft. Poirot smiled faintly. A precise man. Edith closed her eyes. He gave me 7 years. Poirot tilted his head. And then he told me he was ill, Edith whispered, that he would not wait any more. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And you asked for one last meeting, Poirot said. Edith nodded. At the tower. The room was quiet, except for the faint tick of the inn's mantel clock. Edith spoke again, voice steadier now. I did not want him to die, she said. I wanted him to hesitate. Poirot nodded. Fear again. Edith swallowed. The sound startled him. He collapsed. I thought he fainted. Poirot's gaze was kind. And then? I panicked, Edith said. I ran. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Running, he said softly, is the final confession. Edith nodded once. I will not run again. Fenwick entered quietly as Edith finished speaking. Poirot looked up. You heard? Fenwick nodded. Enough! Poirot turned back to Edith. You understand the consequences. Edith's voice was calm. Yes? Poirot inclined his head. Then the village will understand something else. Edith frowned. What? Poirot's tone was gentle but firm. That silence is never neutral. The causer? The afternoon brought argument to Ashmore. Not shouting. Ashmore did not shout, but sharp words exchanged in doorways, stares held too long, and an unspoken question that moved from house to house. Who else knew? The council convened again. This time there were raised voices. The butcher accused the grocer of knowing too much. The schoolteacher asked why repairs were never funded. The publican demanded to know who removed Poirot's notice. By evening, the village had done something it had not done in 7 years. It spoke. Poirot walked the square as dusk fell. The clock tower loomed above him, still cracked, still frozen, but no longer dominant. It looked smaller now, diminished by understanding. Fenwick joined him. "They're asking about repairs," Fenwick said. "Some want it fixed." Poirot smiled faintly. "And others?" Fenwick sighed. "Others want it torn down." Poirot nodded. "A familiar choice." Fenwick frowned. "Which do you recommend?" Poirot looked up at the tower. "Neither," he said quietly. "Repair the agreement, not the stone." Fenwick blinked. "Sir?" Poirot tapped his cane on the cobbles. "Fixing the clock will not fix the village." Fenwick absorbed this. That night, Poirot remained awake until midnight, not because he expected a sound, because he wanted to hear the absence of one. At 11:59, the square was empty. At 12, nothing happened. No crack, no whisper, no staged announcement. Poirot closed his eyes. "That," he murmured, "is accountability." The following morning, the Crown's representative arrived. Formal statements were taken, evidence catalogued, the mechanical timer, the wedge, the letters, all labelled and sealed. Edith Vale was taken into custody without spectacle. She did not look back. The vicar's house was locked. The village watched quietly. Poirot stood apart. Before leaving Ashmore, Poirot paid one last visit to the clock tower. The door was open now, no longer sealed by fear or convenience. Sunlight streamed inside, illuminating dust and stone, and the honest decay of old mechanisms. Poirot stepped inside alone. He climbed halfway and stopped at the landing. He listened, not to the tower, to himself. "You see," he murmured, "time did not kill Jonathan Crowe." He rested his hand on the stone wall. People did, by asking it to wait. Poirot descended and stepped back into the square. The tower stood silent behind him. For the first time, its silence felt earned. Chapter 8. When Time Refused to be Blamed. The law arrived in Ashmore the way winter sometimes did, quietly, efficiently, and without concern for local habits. By the second morning after Edith Vale's confession, the village square was occupied not by whispers, but by paperwork. Ledgers replaced lanterns, statements replaced speculation, and the clock tower, once the village's most powerful excuse, became merely a structure awaiting a decision. Hercule Poirot observed the transformation with calm detachment. He had seen this stage many times before, the moment when mystery surrendered to administration, and yet, in Ashmore, something subtle was different. The villagers were not asking what would happen next, they were asking why it had taken so long. The Crown's representative, Mr. Alastair Benwick, conducted proceedings from the council hall, a narrow building that suddenly felt too small for the weight of 7 years. Edith Vale's statement was read aloud. So was Reverend Hawthorne's correspondence. The mechanical timer was displayed briefly, passed from hand to hand like a relic stripped of superstition. No one gasped, no one protested. The shock had already happened. This was recognition. Outside, Poirot stood with Constable Harold Fenwick beneath the clock tower's shadow. "They're angry," Fenwick said quietly. Poirot nodded. "Yes, anger is honesty's younger brother." Fenwick frowned. "At whom?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Everyone." Fenwick glanced up at the frozen clock hands. "They still want to blame the tower." Poirot's voice was gentle. "Of course they do. It is easier to accuse stone than memory." The preliminary charges were announced before noon. Edith Vale, criminal negligence contributing to death, obstruction of lawful inquiry, unlawful alteration of public land. Reverend Miles Hawthorne, conspiracy to obstruct justice, inducement, and long-term concealment of material facts. Jonathan Crowe, officially cleared of all wrongdoing, a formal declaration that arrived too late to matter to him. The village listened. No cheers, no cries, only the quiet discomfort of recognition. That afternoon, Poirot walked alone through Ashmore, not investigating, not questioning, simply witnessing. He passed Mrs. Morton's shop, where customers now spoke openly about council votes and delayed repairs. He passed the inn, where Thomas Greaves no longer wiped the same patch of counter. He served drinks with nervous energy, as though trying to prove usefulness, and he passed the vicarage, its windows dark, its door sealed. The absence of authority was more unsettling than its presence had ever been. Poirot paused at the edge of the river path. From here, the clock tower was partially obscured by trees, diminished, almost ordinary. He reflected on Jonathan Crowe, a man who had not been killed for greed, nor passion, nor vengeance, but for insisting that time could not be negotiated indefinitely. Such men, Poirot murmured, are rarely thanked. That evening, a public meeting was called. This time, attendance was mandatory, not by decree but by necessity. Ashmore could no longer afford private truths. The council hall filled. Arguments followed. Some demanded the tower be repaired immediately, and to prove the village had nothing left to hide. Others wanted it dismantled, stone by stone, to erase the memory entirely. Poirot was asked for his opinion. He rose slowly. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said, "you believe the clock tower caused this tragedy." Murmurs followed. Poirot continued calmly. "But the tower did nothing by itself. You used it. You hid behind it. You blamed it when truth felt inconvenient." Silence fell. Poirot concluded softly. "Do not punish the tower. Punish the habit." No vote was taken that night. Some decisions required time, real time, not borrowed silence. At the inn, later, Fenwick joined Poirot with 2 cups of tea. "They asked if you'd stay," Fenwick said. "Help guide the transition." Poirot smiled gently. "I am a detective, not a conscience." Fenwick hesitated. "Still, you changed something here." Poirot stirred his tea. "No, I merely stopped it from being postponed." That night, Poirot did not watch the clock. He slept deeply. For the first time since arriving in Ashmore, midnight passed unnoticed, not because nothing happened, but because nothing needed to happen. The absence of drama was the truest proof of resolution. The next morning brought a quiet announcement. The clock tower would remain standing. Its mechanism would not be repaired immediately. A plaque would be placed, not commemorating Jonathan Crowe's death, but acknowledging the years of concealment. Some found this unsatisfactory. Poirot approved entirely. "Memory," he said softly to Fenwick, "should not be convenient." Before leaving Ashmore, Poirot made one final visit to the tower. He stood beneath it, looking up at the cracked face, the frozen hands. "You were never broken," he murmured, "only misused." He touched the stone once, lightly, respectfully, and turned away. Behind him the tower remained silent, not because it had nothing to say, but because no one was asking it to lie anymore. Chapter 9. The Village After the Verdict. Ashmore Village did not celebrate the end of the investigation. It did not know how. There were no bells to ring, no triumphant speeches, no sense of victory, only the slow, unsettling feeling of a long-held weight shifting from the shoulders to the hands. People were now forced to carry what they had once avoided. Truth, Poirot thought, is heavier when it is finally touched. The morning after the council hall meeting, the square looked unchanged. Shops opened, smoke rose from chimneys. A cart rolled over cobblestones with the same familiar creak. But the village itself had changed. It spoke in fuller sentences now. It looked at one another longer than before, and when they glanced at the broken clock tower, they did so not with superstition, but with discomfort. Hercule Poirot stood outside the inn, suitcase at his feet, watching the slow movement of Ashmore's new reality. Constable Harold Fenwick approached quietly. "They've begun petitioning the county," Fenwick said, "about land boundaries, about the river embankment, about everything." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, now they wish to be precise." Fenwick hesitated. "Some are angry at you." Poirot tilted his head. "Only some?" Fenwick managed a brief smile. "Some are grateful, they just don't know how to show it." Poirot nodded. "Gratitude is difficult for those who preferred denial." Fenwick looked toward the clock tower. "They're arguing again, repair or dismantle." Poirot's voice was gentle. "They will argue for months." Fenwick frowned. "And what do you think?" Poirot picked up his suitcase. "I think the tower is not their problem." Fenwick blinked. Then what is? Poirot's eyes softened. Their habit of waiting. Poirot made one last circuit through the village before leaving, not to investigate, to say farewell to the atmosphere, to the place itself. He walked past Mrs. Morton's shop first. Eliza Morton stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, eyes cautious but less fearful than before. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice low, "they say you'll be leaving." Poirot bowed slightly. "Yes, madame. The village will now continue without me." She hesitated. "Will it be all right?" Poirot considered. "All right," he said carefully, "is not a guarantee. It is a choice." Mrs. Morton swallowed. "We didn't choose well before." Poirot's gaze held hers gently. "You may choose differently now." Her eyes shimmered, and she nodded once, a small private acknowledgement that felt more sincere than any public speech. At the inn, Thomas Greaves was scrubbing the front step with more energy than necessary. Poirot paused. "Monsieur Greaves," he said, "you removed the notice." Greaves froze, his face reddened. Poirot raised a hand. "Do not defend, just answer. Why?" Greaves exhaled. "Because I didn't want people gathering, I didn't want—" "Talk," Poirot nodded. "You wanted quiet." Greaves looked down. "I thought quiet was safety." Poirot's voice softened. "Quiet is sometimes only delay." Greaves swallowed. "Will they blame me now?" Poirot shook his head. "They will blame many things, but blame is not the point." Greaves looked up, confused. Poirot met his gaze. "Responsibility is—" Greaves stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as though learning a language he had avoided. Poirot's final visit was to the river path. He walked to the edge of the old Vale Mill property. Not entering, merely observing, the embankment wall stood firm, new stone against old earth. It looked safe. But safety, Poirot knew, was not merely physical, it was ethical. He turned away and walked back toward the square. The clock tower rose above the rooftops, still cracked, still frozen at 11:58. Yet its power had diminished, not because it had changed, but because the village had stopped using it as a story. On that afternoon, Poirot received a brief update from Mr. Benwick, the Crown representative. The cases would proceed to trial. The estate and land disputes would be reviewed. Ashmore would be mapped and measured thoroughly. The truth would become official, which meant it would become boring, which meant it would become harder to mythologize. Poirot approved. A myth was simply a lie that had learned to be charming. Fenwick accompanied Poirot to the station. The walk was quiet. At the edge of the lane, Fenwick stopped. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "I keep thinking about Jonathan Crowe." Poirot nodded. "Yes," Fenwick's voice tightened. "He died for insisting on truth, and yet—" Poirot finished softly. "And yet the truth will feel like inconvenience." Fenwick exhaled. "Exactly." Poirot's gaze was kind. "This is often the reward of honesty, Constable. Not gratitude, but discomfort." Fenwick looked down. "Then why do it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Because comfort built on lies collapses eventually, and then it collapses with interest." Fenwick absorbed this silently. The train arrived with a soft hiss. Poirot stepped aboard, turned and looked back at Ashmore village one final time. From the station platform, the clock tower was just visible between trees, a dark, rigid line against the sky. Poirot lifted his hat slightly, not to the tower, but to the moment. He entered his compartment and sat by the window. As the train began to move, the village slid away in layers. Hedges, roofs, the square, the river path, and then only the tower remained, distant and small. Poirot removed his notebook. He did not write about the mechanical timer. He did not write about the wedge. Those details would be filed, documented, archived. The law would preserve them. Instead, he wrote something for himself. The most dangerous crime in Ashmore was not the staging of midnight. It was the agreement to postpone truth. Poirot closed the notebook. The rails hummed beneath him. Tick, 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 time again. Ordinary, relentless, honest. Poirot listened. No whisper followed, and that was the only ending he truly trusted. Chapter 10. Midnight without a witness. Midnight came to Ashmore village without ceremony. No lanterns gathered, no footsteps hurried across the square. No one looked up at the clock tower expecting it to speak. That alone told Hercule Poirot everything he needed to know. He was no longer in Ashmore when it happened, already miles away, already carried forward by rails and routine. Yet the village felt closer than ever, as if distance had finally given it proper perspective. Some mysteries end with answers. Others end with habits changing. This one belonged to the second kind. On the night Poirot left, Ashmore did not mark the hour. Mrs. Morton finished her accounts and went to bed without glancing at the square. Thomas Greaves locked the inn earlier than usual and did not pause at the doorway. The councilmen argued late into the evening, then went home exhausted, their voices hoarse from saying too much at last. And the clock tower, cracked, frozen and unmoving, stood unnoticed for the first time in 7 years. It had finally been demoted, from symbol to structure, from excuse to stone. Poirot's train moved steadily through the countryside, the rhythm beneath his feet honest and unadorned. He sat with his notebook closed, his thoughts unhurried. He did not replay the argument beneath the tower. He did not revisit the sharp crack at midnight. He did not reconstruct Jonathan Crow's final moments. Those things were finished. Instead, Poirot reflected on what remained. A village that had learned the cost of postponement, a clock that no longer bore the burden of lies, and a death that, while tragic, had forced truth into daylight. "It is rarely the murderer," Poirot murmured to himself, "who teaches the final lesson." The train passed through a small station. Somewhere a clock chimed the hour, clear, mechanical, unremarkable. Poirot smiled faintly. In Ashmore, the Crown's work continued. Edith Vale's trial would not be dramatic. It would be measured, careful, and exacting, as Jonathan Crow would have preferred. Reverend Hawthorne's fall from authority would be quieter still, a gradual erosion rather than a collapse. There would be no villainous speeches, no dramatic revelations, only records corrected, land remeasured, and signatures added where silence once lived. That, Poirot knew, was justice in its truest form. A week later, the village placed the plaque. It did not praise, it did not accuse, it read, "For 7 years this tower stood silent, not from failure, but from choice. May this village remember the cost of waiting." Some villagers disliked it. They said it was uncomfortable. They said it was unnecessary. They said it kept old wounds open. Others said nothing at all, and that, at last, was the right kind of silence. Poirot read about the plaque in a brief letter from Constable Fenwick. The young constable wrote plainly, without embellishment, "They don't look at the tower the same way anymore. They look at each other instead." Poirot folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. "Good," he murmured. That was the outcome he had hoped for. Not peace, but attention. One evening later, in his London apartment, Poirot stood before his mantel clock. It was precise, polished, perfectly maintained. He adjusted it slightly, ensuring it aligned exactly with the edge of the shelf. Order mattered, but obsession did not. He sat with a cup of tea and allowed the case to settle into memory, not as a puzzle solved, but as a warning delivered. He imagined Ashmore at midnight, the square empty, the tower ignored, time passing without supervision, and he felt something close to satisfaction. C'était juste so classic radio-style outro listener address. And so, dear listener, we leave Ashmore village, not with a chime, nor with a whisper, but with something far rarer, honesty. The broken clock tower still stands. Its hands remain frozen, its face still cracked, but it no longer lies, because the truth was never hidden in gears or bells or midnight tricks. It was hidden in patience stretched too far, in silence mistaken for virtue, and in the belief that time could be asked to wait forever. Jonathan Crow learned otherwise, and because of him, so did Ashmore. Tonight, as you listen to the quiet tick of your own clock, remember this: time does not judge. Time does not forgive. Time only reveals what we refuse to face. Good night, and may your midnight pass without secrets,